Victoria Reynolds stood frozen in the aisle, holding her first-class boarding pass as the flight attendant sneered. There must be a mistake. 20 minutes later, she walked back through that same cabin, now CEO mode activated, watching horror spread across the crew's faces as recognition dawned. Their careers ended today. Before we dive into this shocking story of racism and redemption, where are you watching from today? Hit that like button if you've ever witnessed discrimination in action, and subscribe to join our community fighting for justice. Now, let's discover how this powerful black woman turned a moment of humiliation into a corporate revolution. Victoria Reynolds was not someone who accepted defeat easily. At 38, she had already shattered more glass ceilings than most people encountered in a lifetime. As the newly appointed CEO of Aerodynamics International, a Fortune 500 company that had recently acquired the luxury airline Luxair, Victoria had earned every accolade through relentless work and brilliant strategy. Her resume read like a success story that seemed almost fictional. Harvard MBA with highest honors, strategic leadership that rescued 3 failing corporations from bankruptcy, and a vision that consistently put her ahead of market trends. Throughout her career, Victoria had faced and overcome barriers that kept many equally talented black professionals from reaching such heights. Each promotion had required twice the effort and 3 times the results of her white counterparts, a reality she acknowledged but refused to be defined by. This particular Thursday had started with immense pressure. Victoria had a critical investors meeting in New York at 9 a.m., where she would present the integration strategy for Luxair, the company's newest acquisition. By evening, she needed to be in Chicago for her daughter Zoe's piano recital, an event she had promised not to miss after being absent from the last 3 due to work emergencies. "I can take the noon Luxair flight," Victoria told her executive assistant Grace Chen that morning. "I want to experience their service firsthand, see what we're really working with." "Should I notify their management that you'll be on board?" Grace asked. Already typing an email, Victoria paused, considering. "No, book it under my name. But don't alert anyone. I want to see the authentic experience, not a performance put on for the boss." Grace nodded, understanding immediately. Incognito assessment. Smart. The morning had gone sideways almost immediately. During the investors' meeting, someone had bumped Victoria's arm, causing her to spill coffee down her cream-colored designer suit. The presentation had gone brilliantly despite the setback, but afterward, Victoria had no choice but to change into the casual clothes she kept in her office for emergencies. Dark jeans and a simple navy blouse. Not her typical CEO attire, but it would have to do. She checked in for her flight online, bypassing the counter service, and proceeded directly to the gate. As Victoria walked through the terminal, she noticed the sidelong glances. The first class lounge was filled predominantly with white executives in tailored suits, their eyes following her with undisguised curiosity. As she entered the space traditionally reserved for people who didn't look like her, "Membership card, please?" the lounge attendant asked with exaggerated politeness, though Victoria had already placed her first-class boarding pass on the counter. "My boarding pass indicates I have access," Victoria replied calmly, sliding it forward again. The attendant examined it with theatrical scrutiny before reluctantly allowing her entry. As boarding time approached, Victoria lined up in the priority lane. Around her, businessmen in expensive suits gave her curious glances, some whispering to each other. She kept her focus forward, accustomed to being the only black woman in predominantly white spaces. "First-class boarding now," announced the gate agent, a young white man whose name read Daniel Walker. Victoria stepped forward, extending her boarding pass and ID. Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly as he examined her ticket, then looked at her jeans and simple blouse. "Are you sure you're in the right line?" he asked, loud enough for others to hear. "This is for first-class boarding only." "Yes, I'm aware," Victoria replied evenly. "As you can see from my boarding pass." Daniel checked her ticket again, flipping it over as if expecting to find some explanation for why someone who looked like Victoria would be flying first class. "You might be more comfortable in the general boarding line," he suggested with a thin smile. I'm quite comfortable right here, Victoria responded, maintaining her professional tone despite the growing frustration. My boarding pass clearly shows seat 2A, first class. After checking her ticket a third time, Daniel reluctantly scanned it, his expression still communicating disbelief. Have a nice flight, he said without making eye contact, already looking past her to the white executive standing next. Victoria took a deep breath and proceeded down the jetway, mentally noting Daniel's name and behavior. As the new owner of Luxair, she was collecting data points, and this was certainly one worth remembering. Victoria stepped onto the aircraft, boarding pass in hand, prepared for the usual first-class welcome. Instead, she found herself immediately confronted by the lead flight attendant, a blonde woman in her 40s whose name identified her as Patricia Miller. Excuse me, Patricia said, blocking Victoria's path with her beverage cart. First-class passengers are still boarding. Economy will begin boarding shortly. Victoria extended her boarding pass. I am in first class, seat 2A. Patricia's eyes narrowed as she examined the boarding pass, her lips pursing in obvious disbelief. Rather than apologizing or stepping aside, she signaled to other flight attendants. Keith, Sophia, can you come check this, please? Patricia called, holding Victoria's boarding pass aloft like evidence at a trial. The flight attendants approached quickly. Keith Barnes, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, took the boarding pass from Patricia and studied it with exaggerated care. Sophia Turner, younger with a tight ponytail, peered over his shoulder. There seems to be some confusion, Keith said, his voice dripping with condescension. Are you sure you didn't mistakenly receive a first-class boarding pass? Perhaps there was an error at check-in. Victoria maintained her composure, though her heartbeat quickened. There's no confusion. That is my correct boarding pass for seat 2A. The exchange was drawing attention. First-class passengers already seated were watching with expressions ranging from discomfort to amusement. One middle-aged white man in an expensive suit, who would later be identified as Michael Thompson, chief financial officer of a major banking corporation, leaned into the aisle. Is there a problem? He called out. Some of us would like to get settled before the economy. Passengers clog up the aisles. The implication was clear. In his mind, Victoria belonged in economy, not first class. We're just sorting out a seating confusion, Sophia explained to Thompson with a conspiratorial smile. I've provided my boarding pass, Victoria stated firmly. There's no confusion except the one you're creating, ma'am. Perhaps you misunderstood the boarding process, Patricia suggested, her voice rising slightly. Economy boarding will begin soon. You'll need to exit and wait until your group is called. Victoria felt heat rising in her cheeks, but kept her voice measured. I understand perfectly. What I don't understand is why my valid first-class boarding pass is being questioned when none of the other passengers received this treatment. Round her, the white passengers in first class were being greeted warmly, offered pre-flight beverages, and helped with their luggage. The contrast was stark and unmistakable. I need to see some ID, Patricia demanded, hand extended. Victoria provided her driver's license, which Patricia scrutinized with theatrical thoroughness. Victoria Reynolds, Patricia read aloud, as if testing the authenticity of the name. And how did you come to be in first class today, Ms. Reynolds? The question hung in the air, loaded with assumptions. How could someone like you afford first class? Was the unspoken subtext. I purchased a ticket, just like everyone else, Victoria replied, her patience wearing thin. By now, a line had formed behind Victoria. The flight manager, Trevor Wilson, approached, his face set in a practiced customer service smile that didn't reach his eyes. What seems to be the issue here? He asked Patricia, completely ignoring Victoria's presence. This passenger claims to have a first-class ticket, Patricia explained, emphasizing claims as if Victoria were attempting a scam. Trevor turned to Victoria with an expression of practiced patience. May I see your boarding pass and ID? Please. Victoria had already provided both, but she watched as Trevor re-examined them with the same skepticism as the others. Meanwhile, white passengers continued to board. Walking around the confrontation, without being asked for additional verification. These documents appear to be in order, Trevor finally admitted, though his tone suggested this was somehow surprising. However, for security purposes, I'll need to verify this with the gate. Is that standard procedure for all first-class passengers? Victoria asked pointedly. Trevor ignored her question, stepping aside to use the cabin phone. Victoria remained standing in the aisle, surrounded by staring passengers, the center of an unnecessary spectacle. She clearly doesn't belong up here. Someone whispered loud enough for Victoria to hear. Probably used points or got an upgrade. Another responded, no way she paid full price. Victoria stood perfectly still, her face a mask of professional detachment while internally cataloging every comment, every slight. She had experienced racism throughout her career, the subtle kind that came with plausible deniability, the type that made you question whether you were being oversensitive. But this was blatant, undeniable, and happening in full view of dozens of witnesses. After what felt like an eternity, but was actually about 3 minutes, Trevor returned. "You can take your seat," he said curtly, without apology or acknowledgement of the humiliation they had subjected her to. Victoria moved to her seat, feeling the eyes of every passenger and crew member following her. As she stowed her laptop bag and settled in, she noticed how the flight attendants lavished attention on the white passengers around her, while studiously avoiding eye contact with her. When Patricia finally approached with the beverage tray, her smile had vanished entirely. "Water," Victoria said simply. Patricia placed a plastic cup on Victoria's tray table with such force that water sloshed over the side, then moved on without a word. Victoria dabbed at the spilled water with a napkin, her mind working quickly. This wasn't just poor customer service, this was a systemic issue that reflected directly on the company she now owned, and she was beginning to formulate exactly how she would address it. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Victoria sat quietly observing the cabin service unfold around her. Patricia, Keith, and Sophia moved efficiently through the first-class cabin, offering warm towels, taking drink orders, and chatting amiably with passengers, all passengers except her. When they reached her row, their smiles vanished. Service became perfunctory, and they moved on as quickly as possible. Was this really happening in 2025? Victoria wondered as she watched Keith laugh at a joke from the white businessman across the aisle, while completely ignoring her request for a blanket. How many other black passengers had experienced this same treatment? Victoria pulled out her phone and sent a text to Grace. Need background on Luxair's customer service history. Focus on discrimination complaints, urgent. Grace's response came quickly, already on it. Hearing troubling things about their company culture. Will send details shortly. Victoria's instincts had been correct. The exceptional service that Luxair advertised apparently came with conditions. Based on what you looked like or how much money they assumed you had. As she waited for Grace's research, Victoria began methodically documenting every interaction, the time Keith offered refills to everyone in the row except her, how Sophia placed a hot towel on her tray without even looking at her, Patricia's loud conversation with another passenger about people who don't belong in first class causing problems. Victoria recorded it all, building a case with the precision that had made her such a successful executive. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted file from Grace. The information was worse than she had expected. Multiple complaints had been filed against this exact crew for similar treatment of minority passengers, yet all had been dismissed or buried by Luxair management. There were social media posts detailing discriminatory experiences, employee reviews mentioning a toxic culture, and internal memos revealing a pattern of protecting problematic employees who maintain the right image for the airline. Have you ever been treated differently because of how you look? Comment number 1 if you've experienced discrimination firsthand, or number 2 if you've witnessed it happening to someone else. Hit that like button if you believe companies should be held accountable for discriminatory practices, and subscribe to see more stories of justice being served. What would you do if you were in Victoria's position? Would you confront the issue head-on or handle it behind the scenes? As Victoria scrolled through the evidence, memories from her own career surfaced. the time she was mistaken for a secretary. In her own executive meeting, the promotion she was passed over for despite outperforming every metric, the constant need to be twice as good, twice as prepared, twice as professional just to be considered equal. She thought of her mother, Dorothy Reynolds, who had cleaned office buildings at night so Victoria could attend good schools during the day. Before she passed away 5 years ago, Dorothy had made Victoria promise something: when you reach the top, don't forget to fix the ladder for those coming after you. This wasn't just about one humiliating experience on a flight. This was about a system that allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. As CEO of the parent company that now owned Luxair, Victoria had the power to do something that most victims of discrimination never got the chance to do: create real, structural change. Mid-flight, another file arrived from Grace containing Luxair's customer satisfaction data broken down by demographics. The disparities were striking. White male passengers consistently reported excellent service, while women, particularly women of color, reported significantly lower satisfaction scores. The data had been collected but never addressed. Victoria spent the remainder of the flight watching the crew interact with every passenger, mentally comparing the warmth and attention given to the height executives versus the cursory service provided to the few other passengers of color in business class. The pattern was undeniable. When Patricia accidentally spilled coffee on the paperwork Victoria was reviewing, offering only a perfunctory sorry before walking away without helping to clean up, Victoria made her decision. This crew wouldn't simply be reported or reprimanded. They would become an example of the new standard her company would uphold. As the plane began its descent, Victoria sent one final message to Grace: prepare for emergency meeting at Luxair HQ immediately. After landing, full executive team, HR, legal, and find out everything you can about flight attendants Patricia Miller, Keith Barnes, Sophia Turner, and flight manager Trevor Wilson. Grace's response was immediate. Already done. Executive team will meet you at the gate. Car waiting on tarmac. Victoria put away her phone and closed her eyes briefly, centering herself for what was to come. When she opened them again, she was no longer Victoria Reynolds, humiliated passenger. She was Victoria Reynolds, CEO of Aerodynamics International, and she was about to remind everyone exactly what that meant. As the plane touched down, Victoria remained seated while other passengers gathered their belongings and filed out. She watched Patricia, Keith, Sophia, and Trevor at the front of the cabin. Their postures relaxed as they bid farewell to deplaning passengers with practiced smiles. They hadn't given Victoria a second thought since their initial confrontation, clearly assuming she was just another passenger they would never see again. Victoria made 3 quick calls while waiting, first to her legal counsel, then to her chief of staff, and finally to the head of human resources. By the time she stood to exit the plane, her strategy was set in motion. When Victoria finally walked to the front of the cabin, Trevor was checking something on a tablet while the flight attendants chatted among themselves. None of them paid her any attention until she stopped directly in front of them. "Excuse me," Victoria said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms. Patricia looked up with obvious annoyance. "Yes, I'd like all of your names for my report," Victoria stated calmly. This caught their attention. Keith straightened his posture. Sophia's smile became fixed, and Trevor finally looked directly at Victoria. "Report," Trevor asked, his tone dismissive. "If you have concerns, you can fill out a customer feedback form online. I have a more direct method in mind," Victoria replied, just as the jetway door reopened. Through it walked 5 impeccably dressed executives, led by Grace Chen. The confusion on the crew's faces was immediate. "Ms. Reynolds," Grace said formally, "your executive team is assembled as requested. The car is waiting to take us directly to Luxair headquarters." The blood drained from Trevor's face as realization dawned. Patricia's mouth opened slightly. Keith took an involuntary step backward, and Sophia's eyes widened in alarm. "You're..." Trevor couldn't even finish the sentence. "Victoria Reynolds, CEO of Aerodynamics International, parent company and owner of Luxair," Victoria completed. For him, extending her business card. And yes, we need to talk. All of us. Now, the drive to Luxair headquarters was silent and tense. Victoria had changed into the spare executive outfit kept in her travel car. A tailored black suit that radiated authority. The flight crew had been instructed to follow in a separate company vehicle, giving Victoria time to brief her team. At Luxair's corporate offices, they were met by Richard Anderson, the current CEO of Luxair, and Amanda Stevens, the chief operating officer. Both looked confused and concerned by the unexpected arrival of their new parent company's CEO. With an entourage of executives, "Victoria, what an unexpected pleasure," Richard said, extending his hand. "Had we known you were visiting today, we would have prepared a proper welcome." "This isn't a scheduled visit, Richard," Victoria replied, her tone professional but cool. "I need your largest conference room immediately. Have your HR director and legal counsel join us as well." Within 30 minutes, they were all assembled. Around the gleaming conference table, Victoria and her team on one side, the Luxair executives on the other, and the flight crew looking distinctly uncomfortable at the far end. Victoria stood, commanding the room's attention without raising her voice. "Today, I experienced firsthand the culture that exists within Luxair. I boarded Flight 372 as a first-class passenger and was subjected to treatment that was not only unprofessional but discriminatory." She nodded to her chief technology officer, who projected a series of video clips onto the wall screen. Security footage from the flight showing clear differential treatment between Victoria and other passengers. "Our team has been monitoring customer experience metrics since the acquisition," Victoria continued. "What I experienced today is, unfortunately, not an isolated incident." Grace distributed tablets containing a comprehensive database of complaints that had been filed against Luxair over the past 5 years, with particular emphasis on the crew present in the room. 17 formal complaints against Patricia Miller for discriminatory behavior toward minority passengers, 12 against Keith Barnes, 9 against Sophia Turner, and 23 instances where Trevor Wilson dismissed or buried these complaints. Without proper investigation, Richard Anderson leaned forward, his face flushing. "Victoria, surely one uncomfortable experience doesn't warrant this inquisition. I'm certain there's been a misunderstanding that we can resolve privately." "This isn't about one experience, Richard. This is about a pattern," Victoria replied, signaling her team to display the next set of data. A breakdown of customer satisfaction scores by race and gender that showed alarming disparities. "Your own data tells the story. You've been collecting this information for years, but taking no action," Amanda Stevens interjected. "These metrics can be interpreted in multiple ways. Correlation doesn't imply causation, perhaps," Victoria acknowledged, "but combined with direct observation, documented complaints, and witness testimonies, they paint a compelling picture." She revealed that during the flight, she had quietly spoken with several regular Luxair passengers who had observed the differential treatment and provided their contact information for follow-up. Patricia finally spoke up, her voice tight with indignation. "With all due respect, Ms. Reynolds, you're blowing this out of proportion. We treat all passengers according to company protocol. Is it company protocol to ask only black passengers for additional ID verification? To suggest they're in the wrong section of the plane despite having valid boarding passes? To provide substandard service compared to white passengers?" Victoria's questions hung in the air, unanswered. "I was simply doing my job," Patricia insisted. "Security protocols require—" "I've reviewed your security protocols," Victoria interrupted. "They don't require what I experienced today." For the next hour, Victoria methodically presented evidence, dismantling every excuse offered by the crew or Luxair executives. When Richard attempted to suggest that Victoria's casual attire might have contributed to the confusion, Victoria displayed photographs of white passengers in similar casual clothing who had received exemplary service on the same flight. "Here's what happens next," Victoria finally announced, her tone leaving no room for debate. "Luxair will implement a comprehensive overhaul of its training, hiring, and accountability systems, effective immediately. My team has prepared a detailed plan. She distributed documents outlining the changes, new diversity training requirements, revamped complaint procedures, anonymous testing of customer service quality, and clear consequences for discriminatory behavior. As for the individuals involved in today's incident, Victoria continued, turning to face the flight crew directly, "We'll address that shortly." Richard Anderson's face had grown increasingly red throughout the presentation. It was clear he wasn't accustomed to being challenged, especially not by a black woman who now controlled his company's future. "This is completely unnecessary," he sputtered. "Luxair has been operating successfully for 20 years under current management. You can't just waltz in and demand an overhaul." Based on one subjective experience, Victoria smiled thinly. "Actually, Richard, I can, and I am." Richard Anderson was not a man accustomed to losing control. As the meeting adjourned for a brief recess, he cornered Victoria near the refreshment table. His voice low but intense. "You're making a serious mistake, Victoria. There are contractual protections in our merger agreement. You can't simply come in and overhaul existing management structures without board approval." Victoria stirred her coffee calmly. "I'm familiar with the agreement, Richard. Perhaps more familiar than you are with its fine print regarding performance standards and company culture compliance." Richard's jaw tightened. "The board won't stand for this witch hunt. Many of our directors have been with Luxair since its founding." "Yes, I've noticed the remarkable lack of diversity on your board," Victoria replied. "That's on the agenda as well." As Richard stormed off, Victoria received a text from Grace. "Emergency board meeting being called. Are Anderson making calls from his office?" Victoria had anticipated this move. Within minutes, several Luxair board members began arriving, most looking confused and concerned. Victoria recognized them from her pre-acquisition research, predominantly older white men with long-standing relationships with Richard. While waiting for the impromptu board meeting to begin, Victoria discovered something troubling. Grace had accessed the company's complaint management system and found a pattern. Richard had personally intervened to dismiss or downgrade numerous discrimination complaints over the years, many involving the same flight crew from today's incident. When the board meeting convened, Richard immediately went on the offensive. "Ms. Reynolds is proposing radical changes based on a single incident. That was likely a simple misunderstanding," he argued. "These changes would disrupt operations and potentially damage the Luxair brand we've carefully built." Board member Walter Harrison, a silver-haired man in his 70s, nodded in agreement. "Luxair has a certain clientele with expectations about their experience. We need to be careful about changing what's working." Victoria let them talk, noting which board members seemed uncomfortable with the thinly veiled implications and which were nodding along. When Richard finished his impassioned defense, Victoria spoke quietly but firmly. "Gentlemen, I've listened carefully to your concerns. Now I'd like to share some information that may not have been brought to your attention previously." She presented the board with a comprehensive analysis showing how Luxair's discriminatory practices were actually hurting the bottom line. Premium travelers of color were choosing competitor airlines at increasing rates, and social media sentiment analysis revealed growing negative perceptions of the brand among younger, more diverse demographics. "This isn't just about doing what's right, though that should be reason enough," Victoria explained. "It's about the future viability of this airline in a changing marketplace." As the meeting progressed, Amanda Stevens revealed herself as an unexpected adversary. She distributed a confidential memo suggesting that Victoria's proposed changes would cost millions and potentially lead to lawsuits from employees terminated under new policies. "This feels personal rather than strategic," Amanda suggested with practiced concern. "Perhaps Ms. Reynolds' unfortunate experience has clouded her business judgment." Outside the boardroom, the flight crew wasn't remaining passive. Patricia had contacted several longtime flight attendants, painting herself as a victim of corporate politics. Keith had reached out to his uncle, Harold Barnes, a significant Luxair shareholder, requesting intervention. Sophia was collecting statements from sympathetic colleagues claiming Victoria had been confrontational on the flight. When Victoria's team tried to access historical complaint records for further analysis, they discovered the files had been unexpectedly archived and were temporarily unavailable. IT security confirmed someone had used Amanda's credentials to restrict access. That evening, as Victoria prepared to head to her hotel, she received a disturbing call from Zoe's school in Chicago. Someone had called in a threat specifically, mentioning her daughter. The school had increased security and notified police, but they wanted Victoria aware of the situation. "Mom, why are people saying mean things about you online?" Zoe asked during their evening video call. "Some kids at school showed me posts saying you're trying to ruin an airline because you were in a bad mood." Victoria maintained her composure for her daughter's sake, but inside she was furious. Someone was spreading misinformation and it had reached her child. The next morning brought more challenges. Anonymous messages had been sent to Victoria's office, suggesting she back off before things get worse. Several of her own executives were now recommending a compromise, concerned about the merger's stability and stock price fluctuations. "They're just trying to wait you out," Grace advised during a private moment. "They think if they create enough pressure, you'll back down to protect the acquisition and your position." Victoria thought about that as she stared out the window of her temporary office. At Luxair headquarters, backing down would certainly be easier. She could implement some minor changes, issue a corporate statement about continuous improvement, and move on. No one would blame her, no one except herself, and eventually Zoe, who was watching and learning from every decision her mother made. "Arrange a press conference," Victoria told Grace, "tomorrow morning. And get me everything you can find on Richard Anderson's history with this company. The real history, not the polished version. If they wanted a fight, she would give them one, but it would be on her terms with her weapons, truth, data, and the moral high ground." As Grace left to make arrangements, Victoria received a text from an unknown number. "Back off or the merger dies. Your call." CEO. Victoria took a screenshot of the message, added it to her growing file of evidence, and replied with just 2 words, "Watch me." By morning, the situation had escalated beyond Luxair's corporate walls. Someone, likely from the flight crew or Richard's team, had leaked a carefully edited version of the story to social media. The hashtag Luxair racism was trending, but not in the way Victoria might have hoped. The narrative portrayed her as an entitled executive abusing her power to punish employees. Over a minor service issue, Victoria stared at her phone, watching the public backlash unfold in real time. Video clips of Patricia tearfully defending herself on a morning news program were going viral. "I've served passengers of all backgrounds for 15 years without a single complaint," she claimed, despite the documented evidence to the contrary. Aerodynamics stock price had dropped 7% at opening bell. As investors reacted to the controversy, Victoria's phone was flooded with messages from board members, demanding she resolve the situation immediately. As she prepared for an emergency call with her own board, Victoria received the most painful blow yet. A text from Zoe, *Mom, you promised you'd be at my recital tonight. Are you still coming? With a sinking feeling, Victoria realized she had completely forgotten about the recital in the chaos of the past 24 hours, the very event she had specifically taken this flight to attend. "I'm doing everything I can to be there, sweetheart." She replied, knowing even as she typed the words that it was unlikely she could make it. The board call was as difficult as expected. Several directors questioned her judgment in pursuing the discrimination issue so aggressively. "The optics are terrible," said board member James Wilson. "It looks like you're using your position to wage a personal vendetta." "This isn't personal, it's principled," Victoria countered. "And the only reason the optics are terrible is because Richard Anderson's team is controlling the narrative while we remain silent. The merger agreement is now at risk." Another director warned, "Richard has been calling major shareholders directly, suggesting a vote of no confidence in your leadership." As the call continued, Victoria received an alert that Patricia Miller was giving another interview, this time claiming she felt threatened and intimidated by Victoria during their interaction. When the board call finally ended, Victoria had temporary support to continue addressing the issue, but it came with a clear warning: resolve this quickly or face serious consequences. Just as she hung up, Grace rushed in with alarming news. Someone had leaked Victoria's private communications with her executive team, selectively edited to make it appear she had planned to target Luxair staff before ever boarding the flight. They're claiming you set this whole thing up as an excuse to cut costs by firing long-term employees, Grace explained, showing Victoria the news coverage. Has discrimination become so normalized that people rush to defend those who perpetuate it? Comment number 1 if you think Victoria should stand her ground, or number 2 if you believe she should compromise to save her position. Hit that like button if you've ever had to choose between doing what's right and doing what's easy, and subscribe to see how this power struggle unfolds. Will Victoria sacrifice her principles to protect her career, or will she risk everything to fight for justice? By afternoon, the situation had deteriorated further. Victoria's attempts to work with Luxair's communications team were sabotaged. When talking points she provided were leaked to the press with mocking commentary, Richard had organized an unofficial vote of no confidence among Luxair executives, with results predictably not in Victoria's favor. At 4:30 p.m. Chicago time, Victoria's phone rang. It was Zoe. "Mom," her daughter's voice was small. "The recital started, and you're not here." Again, Victoria closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her absence. "Zoe, I'm so sorry. There's a situation at work that..." "There's always a situation at work," Zoe interrupted, her voice breaking. "You promised this time would be different." The call ended before Victoria could respond. She sat motionless, staring at her phone screen. What was she fighting for if she kept breaking promises to the person who mattered most? A gentle knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Grace entered with a concerned expression. "I just got word from IT security," she said quietly. "The leaks are coming from inside your executive team. Charles Burton has been feeding information to Richard's people since yesterday." Charles was Victoria's chief strategy officer, someone she had trusted implicitly. The betrayal stung, but it also clarified things. This wasn't just about Luxair's culture. This was about resistant forces throughout the corporate structure fighting against change, against accountability, against her leadership as a black woman. For the first time since the confrontation began, Victoria felt herself waver. The professional cost was mounting by the hour. The personal cost, Zoe's disappointment, already felt too high. Maybe a strategic retreat would be wiser. Implement some modest changes. Issue a joint statement with Richard about misunderstandings and moving forward. Salvage the merger and her position. Alone in her office, Victoria finally allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. She buried her face in her hands and let the tears come, tears of frustration, exhaustion, and doubt. After a few minutes, she straightened up and wiped her eyes. On her desk was a small framed photo of her mother, Dorothy, that she carried everywhere. Dorothy Reynolds had faced discrimination her entire life, as a cleaning woman, as a single mother, as a black woman with dreams beyond what society told her was possible. She had never backed down. "What would you do, Mom?" Victoria whispered to the photograph. Her phone buzzed with a text from Grace. "Found something big on Richard. When you're ready." Victoria took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and pressed the intercom button. "Send Grace in," she said, "and get me a direct line to the chairman of our board. It's time to stop playing defense." The battle wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. By 8 p.m., Victoria had completely transformed her approach. Instead of responding to each attack piecemeal, she would seize control of the narrative with a single, overwhelming counterstrike. "Call every major shareholder of both companies," she instructed her team. "I want an emergency joint shareholders meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. Attendance is mandatory." While her staff worked through the night contacting shareholders, Victoria focused on building an ironclad case. The information Grace had discovered was explosive. Richard Anderson had been systematically covering up not just discrimination complaints, but actual lawsuits against Luxair. He had created a slush fund to pay settlements with NDA letters, keeping the board and shareholders in the dark about the true extent of the company's toxic culture. Victoria needed corroborating evidence from those who had experienced discrimination firsthand. She directed her legal team to contact former Luxair employees who had filed complaints or left the company under suspicious circumstances, offer to release them from any NDA letters they signed regarding workplace culture issues. Victoria instructed, assure them they'll have protection from retaliation. The response was overwhelming. By midnight, more than 30 former employees had agreed to provide statements about their experiences. Their stories formed a damning pattern of systemic discrimination that went far beyond Victoria's individual experience. At 1 a.m., Victoria received an unexpected call from Tamara Johnson, a former Luxair HR director who had left the company 3 years earlier. "I've been watching what's happening," Tamara said. "I left because I couldn't stomach how Richard and Amanda handled discrimination complaints. I have documentation they don't know I kept, internal memos directing HR to bury complaints from minority passengers and staff." This was exactly what Victoria needed. Evidence of deliberate policy rather than isolated incidents. As the night progressed, Victoria's team uncovered something even more disturbing. The discrimination issues were connected to financial improprieties. Richard had been misallocating funds to cover settlement payments without proper board approval or shareholder disclosure, a potential securities violation. By dawn, Victoria had assembled a comprehensive presentation that addressed not just the cultural issues at Luxair but the governance and financial implications as well. She had transformed a personal humiliation into a business case for sweeping change. At 7 a.m., Victoria took a break from preparation to call Zoe. "I'm so sorry about missing your recital," she began. "It's fine," Zoe replied in the flat tone that teenagers use when things are definitely not fine. "No, it's not," Victoria admitted, "but I need you to understand something. Remember when Mrs. Garcia made Tommy sit at the back of the class last year because she said he was too distracting, but she never did that with any of the white boys?" "Yeah," Zoe said, her interest piqued. "You went to the principal about it, and the superintendent when the principal didn't listen," Victoria added. "That's what I'm doing now, but on a much bigger scale. Sometimes fighting for what's right means making sacrifices." There was a pause before Zoe responded. "Is that why those people are saying those mean things about you online?" "Yes," Victoria answered honestly. "When you challenge the way things have always been, people get uncomfortable. They fight back. So what are you going to do?" Zoe asked. Victoria smiled at the hint of pride she heard in her daughter's voice. "I'm going to show them why they shouldn't have underestimated me." With renewed determination, Victoria finalized her strategy. She wasn't just fighting for herself or even for Luxair's employees and customers. She was fighting for Zoe and countless others who deserved a world where they wouldn't be judged by their skin color. As shareholders began arriving for the emergency meeting, Victoria received unexpected support. Several Luxair board members who had initially seemed aligned with Richard approached her privately. "We didn't know about the settlement fund," admitted board member Elizabeth Chen. "If what you're saying is true, Richard has been keeping us in the dark for years. I have the documentation to prove it," Victoria assured her. Meanwhile, Patricia, Keith, Sophia, and Trevor were growing increasingly desperate. Their attempts to hire high-profile attorneys had been thwarted. When the lawyers learned the full context of the situation, Keith's uncle, the shareholder he had counted on for protection, had distanced himself after learning about the financial improprieties. The crew members now found themselves isolated, with Richard and Amanda focusing on protecting their own positions rather than defending the staff who had executed their unwritten policies. Victoria's executive assistant delivered one final piece of news just before the meeting began. "We've received an anonymous tip from inside Luxair," Grace whispered. "Someone named Conscience sent documentation showing that Richard specifically instructed premium cabin crews to maintain the exclusive atmosphere by discouraging passengers who don't fit the Luxair image." "The smoking gun," Victoria murmured, adding it to her presentation. As she prepared to enter the conference room, Victoria thought about how this had all started with a simple boarding pass and the assumption that she didn't belong. Now she was about to show everyone exactly where she belonged, at the head of the table, leading the way toward change. The atmosphere in Luxair's main conference center crackled with tension as shareholders and board members from both companies filed in. The room had been arranged with a central table for key executives and theater-style seating for shareholders and observers. News of the emergency meeting had leaked, attracting media attention and increasing the stakes for everyone involved. Richard Anderson arrived surrounded by his loyal executives. Projecting confidence with a practiced smile, he nodded to key shareholders, shaking hands and engaging in brief conversations that suggested everything was under control. When Victoria entered with her team, Richard's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Let's get this unnecessary drama resolved, shall we?" he said just loudly enough for Victoria to hear as they passed each other. Victoria took her position at the center of the table, arranging her materials with deliberate calm. Grace sat beside, her tablet ready to project the presentation onto the room's large screens. Once everyone was seated, Richard immediately took the floor without waiting for a formal introduction. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began smoothly. "I regret that we've had to convene this way, but recent events have created confusion that needs clearing up. Ms. Reynolds had an unfortunate experience on one of our flights and has, perhaps understandably, reacted with some emotion." He paused, offering a sympathetic smile toward Victoria that didn't reach his eyes, however. "In business, we must make decisions based on facts, not feelings. The changes Ms. Reynolds is proposing would disrupt the premium experience our customers expect and value. They would impose unnecessary costs and potentially damage the very brand she's supposed to be protecting as CEO of our parent company." Victoria noticed several shareholders nodding along. Richard was good at this, framing her concerns as emotional overreactions while positioning himself as the rational protector of shareholder value. When Richard finally yielded the floor, Victoria stood. Unlike Richard's easy confidence, she projected something different, quiet authority grounded in thorough preparation. "This meeting isn't about an unfortunate personal experience," she began, "though what happened to me was indeed unfortunate and revealing. This meeting is about systemic issues that affect Luxair's culture, operations, customer satisfaction, employee retention, and ultimately, its financial performance." Victoria nodded to Grace, who projected the first slide. Customer satisfaction data broken down by demographics. These are Luxair's own metrics, showing a clear disparity in service quality experienced by different customer groups. White, male passengers consistently report 90% satisfaction. Women report 76%. Passengers of color report 62%. Black women report just 54%. She moved methodically through the data, showing how these disparities had persisted for years without being addressed. She presented testimonials from former employees describing a culture where discriminatory behavior was tacitly encouraged and complaints were suppressed. "This isn't just morally wrong," Victoria emphasized. "It's bad business. The premium travel market is diversifying rapidly. 38% of business travelers in the U.S. now come from minority backgrounds, up from 20% just 5 years ago. Luxair is alienating a growing segment of high-value customers." Richard shifted uncomfortably as Victoria moved to the financial implications. She revealed how settlement payments for discrimination claims had been hidden in miscellaneous operating expenses, effectively concealing the true cost of the company's toxic culture from shareholders. In the past 3 years alone, Luxair has paid out over $12 million in confidential settlements related to discrimination claims, money that should have been disclosed to this board and to you, the shareholders. A murmur ran through the room. This was no longer about cultural sensitivity or personal offense. This was about financial transparency and fiduciary responsibility. Victoria then called forward several former employees who testified about their experiences. Most powerful was Jana Williams, a former first-class flight attendant who had worked alongside Patricia, Keith, and Sophia. "There was an unwritten rule," Jana explained. "Certain passengers belonged in first class and others didn't. We were expected to make the ones who didn't belong feel uncomfortable enough that they wouldn't come back. It was never explicitly stated in training, but it was made clear through feedback and example. As the testimonies continued, Victoria watched the flight crew's reactions. Sophia was visibly distressed. Keith maintained a rigid posture of denial. Patricia appeared increasingly angry, and Trevor looked simply defeated. When it was time for the crew to respond, Patricia stepped forward first, her voice tight with indignation. "These accusations are completely false. I've served passengers of all backgrounds with equal respect throughout my career. Ms. Reynolds is using her power to punish us for a simple misunderstanding." Keith followed with a similar defense, suggesting that any differential treatment was due to company culture rather than personal bias. Trevor attempted to shift blame to policies and training that came from upper management. It was Sophia who broke ranks. "I can't do this anymore," she said suddenly, her voice shaking. "What they're saying is true. We were trained to maintain a certain image in first class. It was always couched in terms of exclusivity and premium atmosphere, but we all knew what it meant." The room fell silent as Sophia continued, tears streaming down her face. "I knew it was wrong, but I was afraid to speak up. I needed this job. But I can't keep lying about what we did. What I did. I'm sorry, Ms. Reynolds. The way we treated you was inexcusable." Patricia tried to interrupt, but Sophia continued, now addressing the shareholders directly. "If you want to know who gave those instructions, look at who's been hiding the complaints all these years. It wasn't us flight attendants who created this culture." All eyes turned to Richard Anderson, whose face had gone from confident to ashen. Victoria moved to the final phase of her presentation, her plan for transforming Luxair's culture and operations. She outlined clear, measurable goals for improving service consistency across all passenger demographics, new training programs, accountability mechanisms, and transparent reporting of complaints and resolutions. "This isn't about punishing individuals," Victoria concluded. "It's about changing a system that has failed its employees, its customers, and ultimately its shareholders. Luxair can be better than this. It must be better than this if it's going to thrive in today's market." When Victoria finished, the room erupted in discussion. Board members huddled in small groups, shareholders consulted with each other, and executives from both companies engaged in intense conversations. After 30 minutes of deliberation, the chairman of Aerodynamics board called for a vote on Victoria's proposed changes. The result was decisive, 78% in favor. Richard Anderson sat motionless as the chairman then called for a second vote on his continued leadership of Luxair. This vote was even more decisive, 81% against. Effective immediately, the chairman announced, Richard Anderson is removed as CEO of Luxair. An interim leadership team will be established under Ms. Reynolds' direction until a permanent replacement is selected. As the meeting adjourned, Victoria approached the flight crew who stood together near the exit, their futures hanging in the balance. "Ms. Turner," Victoria addressed Sophia first, "your honesty today was courageous. It will be taken into consideration in what happens next." Then she turned to Patricia, Keith, and Trevor. "As for the rest of you, I promised accountability, and I intend to deliver it. You'll be hearing from HR this afternoon." As Victoria walked away, Patricia called after her, "You can't just destroy our careers over one bad day." Victoria turned back, meeting Patricia's gaze directly. "This was never about one bad day. This was about a pattern of behavior that you chose to perpetuate, and now you're facing the consequences of those choices." With that, Victoria left the room, already focused on the transformative work ahead and on making it to Chicago in time for Zoe's next recital, which she had already rescheduled her entire calendar to attend. 6 months after the fateful flight that sparked a corporate revolution, Victoria Reynolds stood in the newly redesigned training center at Luxair headquarters. Around her, a diverse group of flight attendants and ground staff participated in an immersive workshop on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. "The scenario we just enacted happens daily across the aviation industry," explained Tamara Johnson, now heading Luxair's new diversity and inclusion department. "But it doesn't have to. Today we're learning not just to recognize these patterns, but to actively disrupt them." Victoria observed quietly from the back of the room. satisfaction warming her chest. The changes at Luxair had been comprehensive and swift. Within weeks of the shareholder meeting, Patricia Miller, Keith Barnes, and Trevor Wilson had been formally terminated following thorough reviews of their personnel files and passenger complaints. Sophia Turner, in recognition of her eventual honesty, had been offered the option of completing extensive retraining and accepting a 6-month probationary period in a different role. The company-wide transformation had gone far deeper than personnel changes. Victoria had implemented new hiring practices that emphasized diversity at all levels, revamped training programs with measurable outcomes, created anonymous testing protocols to ensure consistent service quality, and established a transparent complaint system with clear accountability. Most importantly, she had changed the narrative around what constituted premium service. Luxair's new brand positioning emphasized true hospitality, welcoming all passengers with equal respect and attention regardless of appearance, background, or attire. The results speak for themselves, Grace commented as she joined Victoria, handing her the latest quarterly report. Customer satisfaction scores have increased across all demographics. Employee retention is up 12%, and our market share in the premium travel segment has grown despite industry-wide challenges. Victoria nodded, scanning the numbers, and the most important metric, Grace smiled. The satisfaction gap between demographic groups has decreased from 36 points to just 8. We're not perfect yet, but we're making real progress. As they walked through the terminal later that day, Victoria noticed the visible changes in Luxair's operation. The gate agents and flight attendants reflected the diversity of the passengers they served. The interactions she observed were consistently professional and welcoming across the board. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. Break a leg on your speech tonight. So proud of you, Mom. Victoria smiled. Her relationship with her daughter had strengthened through this ordeal. She hadn't missed a single one of Zoe's events since that night 6 months ago, making it clear that some priorities were non-negotiable. Even for a CEO, the evening's event was the annual Aviation Industry Leadership Awards, where Victoria was being honored for corporate transformation. As she prepared her remarks backstage, she was surprised by an unexpected visitor, Trevor Wilson. "Ms. Reynolds," he said hesitantly, "I wasn't sure you'd see me." Victoria studied the former flight manager carefully. "I'm listening." "I wanted to thank you," Trevor said, the words clearly difficult for him. Getting fired was devastating at the time, but it forced me to confront things about myself I'd been avoiding for years. The ways I'd become complicit in a toxic system. He explained that after losing his position at Luxair, he'd gone through a period of anger and denial before finally confronting his own role in perpetuating discrimination. Now he was working with an aviation consulting firm, specializing in customer experience transformation. "Your actions that day didn't just change Luxair," Trevor concluded. "They changed me. I can't undo what happened, but I'm trying to be part of the solution now." Victoria nodded, appreciating his honesty while recognizing that transformation was rarely linear or simple. "That's all any of us can do, Trevor, recognize our mistakes and work to do better." As she took the stage that evening to accept her award, Victoria surveyed the audience of industry leaders. Many had initially criticized her drastic approach to Luxair's problems, suggesting she should have handled things more discreetly. Now they were scrambling to implement similar reforms in their own companies as Luxair's success made headlines. "The incident that brought me to this stage tonight wasn't unique," Victoria began. "What was unique was the position I held that allowed me to do something about it. Most people who face discrimination don't have the power to fire those who discriminate against them. They don't have the authority to transform company culture. They simply have to absorb the hurt and carry on." She paused, making eye contact with various executives in the audience. "The responsibility falls to those of us who do have that power, not just to address incidents when they occur, but to build systems where such incidents become unthinkable." Victoria outlined how Luxair had established the industry's first scholarship program, specifically for minority students pursuing aviation careers, creating a pipeline of diverse talent for the future. She described their new accountability metrics, that tied executive compensation directly to equity outcomes. And she announced their latest initiative, an industry-wide consortium committed to sharing best practices for building inclusive excellence. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Some longtime customers had balked at the changes, uncomfortable with the more diverse clientele now flying in premium cabins. A few had taken their business elsewhere, but they had been more than replaced by new customers drawn to Luxair's inclusive reputation. Not every employee had embraced the new direction either. Some had left voluntarily, others had been let go when they couldn't or wouldn't adapt. But the vast majority had risen to the occasion, many expressing relief that the unwritten discriminatory expectations had finally been acknowledged and eliminated. As Victoria concluded her speech to enthusiastic applause, she reflected on the journey. What had begun as a humiliating experience in an airplane aisle had catalyzed meaningful change that would impact thousands of employees and millions of passengers. More importantly, it had sent a message to her daughter and countless others that discrimination didn't have to be tolerated, it could be transformed. Back in her office the following Monday, Victoria found a hand-delivered envelope on her desk. Inside was a first-class boarding pass and a note that simply read, "Thank you for making the skies more welcoming for everyone, a grateful passenger." Victoria's journey teaches us that true change requires both courage and strategic action. When faced with discrimination, she didn't just file a complaint and move on. She recognized an opportunity to transform an entire system. The story highlights how racism often hides behind company culture and standard procedures, persisting because good people remain silent. It also demonstrates the power of evidence and preparation. Victoria didn't rely solely on her personal experience. She gathered data, documented patterns, and built an irrefutable case that connected discrimination to business outcomes. Her approach shows that moral arguments become even more powerful when backed by financial implications. Perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that leadership positions come with responsibility. Victoria used her privilege as CEO not just for personal vindication, but to create lasting change for everyone. She understood that meaningful transformation requires dismantling the structures that enable discrimination, not just punishing individual actors. The journey wasn't without personal cost, but Victoria's commitment to both justice and her daughter demonstrates that our choices reflect our true values. Sometimes the hardest path is the one most worth taking. What discrimination have you witnessed in your daily life that needs addressing? Would you have had the courage to do what Victoria did? Comment below with your experiences or thoughts on how you might handle similar situations. If this story inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful racism stories that highlight both injustice and triumph. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that one person can create meaningful change. Thank you for joining our community that believes in accountability and justice. Together, we can transform systems, not just situations.